Jennie Jones is currently living in Brooklyn, New York. She's been showing her work in museum and gallery contexts quite often in New York, but quite actively more and more as the work gets seen at some pretty terrific venues around the United States. As she mentioned earlier, having done a residency in France, she's an artist whose work has been taking her to different countries around the world and opening up this discussion between music, between art, between various legacies and things that she'll talk about tonight. So again, just we want to thank our friends at the High, in particular, Jeff Grove and Virginia Shearer. And without further ado, Jennie Jones.
Hi again. This is so weird. So I don't typically like to read. I like to just have lots of images and things to listen to, and then the Q&A will be the best part. But I am going to start by reading just my artist statement so that there's a very clear framework before I just start going on tangents. So I'm talking right now. My creative practice occupies a unique space in that I aim to examine the cultural intersections of music, theory, art, and history. At its core, my work is a search for a neo-modernism, which Wikipedia defines as neo-modernism is a term that has sporadically been used to describe a philosophical position based on modernism, but addressing the critique of modernism by postmodernism, which is like, okay, a circle within a circle. These notions are manifested through multidisciplinary pieces that incorporate sound, works on paper, and site-based projects. The avant-garde expression of African Americans predominantly in music set a precedent for my aesthetic, which is both abstract and minimal while remaining somewhat representational. The general strands of thought I continue to expand upon are ways of drawing sound and architectural space, and like an installation, listening as a conceptual practice, and the ability of audio equipment to function as an object of art, or art object. As new forms of technology emerge, bringing new ways of listening, our approach to experimental forms of audio in an art context should begin to reflect this evolution and question it. I have become fascinated with the technical devices and tools we use to experience something as undying and ephemeral as music. At the center of my practice are drawings that utilize line as wire, connecting conduits of geometric form and color, and mixed with literal renderings of earbuds, shotgun microphones, and audio decks. The sound pieces I work with have their origin in historic recordings, meaning I'm basically ripping and stealing music and recontextualizing it, manipulating it digitally. And in doing so, I work with concepts such as call and response and counter melody, stop time, silence as presence, tempo and chord changes. So that's like the reading part. So I like to start a lot of my talks, not that I do that many, with this image of John Coltrane in 1962 in the Guggenheim. And the reason this image is so striking to me is that, notice he's pointing at his instrument. He's pointing to his means of expression, but in the visual context of the Guggenheim. So here's this absence and presence, because I feel like the contribution of African American artists to the birth of modernism in the U.S. was an audible one. That their presence wasn't in the museum; it was in the record stores and in the clubs and the music scene. So this is the crux of my work. I think is really about that absence, and like I was saying in the gallery, really feeling like owning or having permission to work in a certain way in an abstract language, and feeling a bit lost in justifying my aesthetic and balancing it with my responsibilities or obligations to sort of talk about African American cultural production. So I had kind of an artist epiphany happen where I was really struggling with content, and I was making these drawings that were kind of just lines and trying to figure out what was going on. And I really had a moment that I realized that what I was listening to was the content, that I spent almost more time curating my music than what I was going to listen to in the studio. And so it was just kind of like, yeah, okay, this is my content. It's been here all along. So that for me was when I started working with sound about 9 years ago. So this is another way to frame things. This is the Alfred J. Barr chart for the first catalog at MoMA in 1935. And I've circled here that the core of modernism is Negro sculpture and the machine aesthetic. And going through all of these channels, we come out with the two non-geometric and geometric abstract art. And in the middle is Third Stream, which is a whole other giant project of early hybrid music, fusing classical music and jazz together. And Günter Schuller coined this phrase, Third Stream, and it occupies a space in between improvisation and very structured ways of music. So my little formula is to equate the non-geometric abstract art with the improvised and with the organic, and I would equate then Pollock to Thelonious Monk, the off notes and the drip. And then on the geometric side is where the Ellsworth Kelly connection comes in for me. The geometric side is something that's very composed and formal, and I would think of the modern jazz quartet. These were really badass guys that went to Juilliard and wore suits and were very structured and actually wrote a lot, looked at the relationship between fugues like Bach and early structures and equated that to what was happening in the same quartet or conversation with jazz quartets. So it's interesting. I would love to know what Kelly listens to or if he listens to anything in the studio, because I think that relationship is definitely there. And at some point, actually, Thelonious Monk did put a Jackson Pollock on an album cover. I don't know what year that was, but there's this funny relationship. Okay. So looking specifically at the linchpin of modernism is the grid. So there's a 1929 Mondrian painting that was simply entitled Composition, and next to a frame from a stage performance of Thelonious Monk, film Straight No Chaser. There's also a really great jazz, it was called Jazz Casuals, and it was on public television in the 60s. And they would make these really crazy sets that were supposed to be like, this is modern, and we're going to have these musicians play, but they would like float squares and float shapes behind these musicians. And another way to reference back to that Coltrane moment where there's this context where they're both defining modernism while they're playing, but then they're also sort of have this funny relationship to the visual language of it. And then this is one of my pieces, which going from grid to grid. This is a 2007 set, my first sculptures, which kind of relate back to the chart of looking at Negro sculpture and the machine aesthetic, is my memorializing the loss of the tangible and how we listen, since we're doing a lot of downloading, and the tangible physical aspect of opening a record, of having to walk across a room to change, lift a needle on a record or turn a tape over. So looking at how we package music, the box set, there was one complete set made in paper and one in hand-brushed aluminum. And it's called The Way We Package Music. But the more I made them, the more I started to think of them also as song containers, like these forms that actually hold songs. So this is another aluminum piece from that set, and it is a double LP. And then these are also hand-brushed aluminum, and they're all to scale. And this is cassette liner notes. And then this is an Ellsworth Kelly called Mirrored Concord from 1971, and it is a chrome-plated steel with a pedestal. So I'm going to do a lot of just little quick compare-contrast without getting too deep, because it's almost like, hitting yourself over the head with it. And initially when Stuart and I started talking about doing a project, there was an exhibition called Artists Address Influence that was going to be at the Contemporary Art Center in Wisconsin, and after financial crisis sort of occurred, they shifted their programming, and they decided to only work within their collection and to not take on any of the new projects. So I had a series of drawings, which we'll get to, and when I was approached for that show, it was the first time that I sort of came out and said, like, yeah, okay, influence, okay, Kelly's an influence. And I kind of think that the curator anticipated that I was going to say Adrian Piper or get into more of a conceptual conversation. So that's how the show Redbird Blue came to be, which just opened last night. So here's a 2001 Kelly print and a cropped section of a Blue Note LP, and looking at the relationship of color field painting and album cover design. That was kind of the linchpin of this conversation, that there's like the chicken and the egg thing going on. There's an Anthony Williams album that's called Spring, and it's just a red color field with the word spring on the bottom. So that was just visually pairing those two things and an entry point to look at Kelly and also in this print for me, when I first saw this, I was thrilled that it was going to be loaned, but I knew this series because it reminded me so much of an open double LP when I saw it, if you flatten out those planes. And the bird aspect comes from Kelly, his interest in nature, but when he was a child he was bedridden, and I have an audio of him talking about that, and interested in gadgetry and the formal aspects of sculpture and audio equipment. I've paired a red speaker next to the Northern Oriole, which is a red and black bird, and I have a little sound bite of Kelly explaining how he got into, let's see if I can play this. Oops. Nope.
Together with birds, visiting birds, and the color of birds.
Yeah. When I was very little, I was ill for a while when I was 5 or 6, and to get well, I guess they gave me books, and I discovered birds on my own. I was a very good birder. I didn't have bird glasses. I just went out. I was fascinated by the colors, and I'm still a bird watcher, but I don't have the time really to do all that. But I think that the early interest in colors, I was just drawn to, say, a black and red.
So it's interesting that Kelly's relationship to nature is so completely visceral, because for me it lends itself more to the bird song and working with sound. And living in the city, too, I'm very conscious of hearing the finches in the morning. And so that was sort of a very poetic way to not just so blatantly go to visual, yes, I do hard edge, hard graphic kind of work, and so does Kelly, and reshaping mid-century modernism and African-American participation from an audible perspective. But there's also just the very poetic, very lovely moment of how we listen and how we see and how we participate in nature as it relates to visual art practice. So this is an Ellsworth Kelly from 1962 called Red, Black, Blue. And my show title is Redbird Blue, so that's a direct play on that. But the series of drawings had the same title, Red, Black, Blue, from 2007, which I'll get to in a minute. So my initial study for the exhibition was a direct comment and looking at the space architecturally and basing it in sequence on that print. But things change and evolve, and our conversations expanded. But this was just such a kooky little drawing. I usually don't make architectural drawings. I thought I would put this in just to see a little bit of a transparency of the thought process. So the exhibition does have my first large-scale wall paintings, and they are based on snippets from album covers, so making color field painting from cropped sections of the Blue Note LP covers and staying within that graphic language. This is, the red one is actually from a monk Thelonious Monk album called just simply The Genius of Modern Music. But I've taken out the title and sort of started to play with just the form of it and the text. So this is the show that opened last night, and this is a speaker, actually. The black bar is a speaker, and these are 2 wall paintings. This is 8 feet square, and this is 11 by 15 feet square. And the bench is very much a part of the installation, and it's based on the benches that Matthew Marks has with each Kelly exhibition. I'm not sure if Ellsworth actually has some say in the placement of the bench or how he wants people to be in a meditative state and to be able to sit and be with the work. But that became an important part of this project for me as well. So this is another view, and you'll see the Kelly that's simply titled Deep Blue. There is bookending my 2009 series, which works with red and blue forms, and they're inside of 45 LP sleeves and working with collage on paper. This is a detail of the black wall painting, and the subtlety, the Blue Note logo actually changes a lot with the light. The space is just gorgeous, and the light changes throughout the day, and I was very pleased to see that the subtlety of black on black and the reflection is much more rich than I had imagined. And I'll play both the sound pieces that are in this exhibition too. So this is the series of drawings. On the long wall, there's a total series of 12, and we have 10 in the exhibition that are red, black, blue. Let's see the detail. So often the works on paper for me use wire as a metaphor. So for me, the use of line is wire, audio wire. And the forms are subwoofers and shotgun microphones and audio jacks and earbuds. So it's about language, the language of abstraction, but it's also how we are plugged into different listening devices and looking strictly at the formal elements of the devices that we use. This is the series that I made in response to the Kelly, but also it was I was on that path anyway. And these are the 45 sleeves, and I tried as much as I could to play with the relationship of color in the same way that Kelly does with his panels when they're mounted on each other. He has panels that were mentioned in the gallery where one is on top of the other. So looking at that relationship and the tension that you get between color was kind of new for me to really focus on that. This is a directional sound speaker that has the bird call of the northern oriole, and a jazz piccoloist named Paul Horn that I've mixed with that, as well as the sound of moving air and bird wings. So I will get to playing that. So we saw the one white Kelly and its relationship to the gallery, but I thought, paralleling this white Kelly with the speaker, because in a sense, all of before doing the wall paintings, all of the flat panel pieces that I had were actually audio equipment that function in both ways as an object, but also as technology. And the lower corner of the installation is another vinyl graphic, sort of making that wall itself into another LP cover. So directly commenting on Kelly's story about birds using the window space at the Contemporary, we've put a bird feeder outside, and I'm hoping that will be a source also when you're on that bench, not just to contemplate the painting and to be in that space and breathe and listen to the sound, but that there'll be some other activity. And I was really lucky to find a birding by ear on cassette on eBay, and it was a pleasure to just listen to all of these different birds and to work with. This is the first time I've worked with something like this in a sound piece. So I've layered, there are two sound pieces in the exhibition. One is called The Color of Birds, and that's coming from the white panel that you just saw. And the other sound piece is I remastered for the show, but I actually made it in 2005, and it's called Slow Birds. And Slow Birds is the first sound piece I made with stretch note, and it's changing the tempo. So it was 4 Charlie Parker notes that have been stretched over 1 minute, and underneath that is a Max Roach drum solo from a song called Little Max that has a lot of little snippets, so I've removed all the other instruments and strung together all of his solos. And then from the, that's emanating from the black speaker that you saw. So when you're in the bench area, you have sound coming from two directions. So for purposes of this talk, I've mixed them together so you'll experience kind of what it's like in the gallery for that. I like the little weird icon of the speaker. So for me, working with sound is really another form of collage and another form of often putting things together that shouldn't be together, and lots of magic happens when you're editing, and things that you think were probably not going to work end up working. And the relationship of the drumming with the bird wings become their own sort of percussion, and the wind instrument with the movement of air. So this was an exciting new way of working for me with this project. Other sound pieces are more specifically like the Charlie Parker piece. I had a series of women in concert with themselves where I would have a chorus of Nina Simone, like finding an a cappella portion of a song and having her harmonize with herself. And so a lot of vocal work. So I'm getting more into to instrumental work, which is a little more challenging because I don't read music. I just listen to a lot of music. So that's a new direction for me. This is just a snippet of flat-paneled speakers that I worked with for an exhibition that was about Charlie Parker and Dean Benedetti, their relationship. This was like a fan of his, and it was called Simply Because You're Near Me. And I listened to the 7 hours of bootleg recordings of Charlie Parker and pulled the phrase from I'm in the Mood for Love, just that phrase, and layered it. And it was coming from these black speakers. And it was the first time I worked with flat panel, and it was also one of the first moments that I realized that audio as a flat panel reads like a painting. And it's challenging with sound in a space because people kind of don't know what to do with their bodies, or they're used to having to look at something or focus on something. So one of the trappings, I think, with making sound pieces is that someone either feels like they have to stare at the equipment that the sound is emanating from, and then you end up with this like, am I supposed to be looking at this on the floor and these wires, or should I be like just listening? And it's challenging. So weirdly enough, people would actually stare at these black panels and read them like paintings. So that was another sort of entry into Kelly. And in 2007, he had this exhibition at Matthew Mark's, which was interesting because I hadn't seen a lot of just black and white paintings by Kelly, and it was bouncing back and forth. So there's this really funny relationship with Kelly that keeps popping up. So I'm going to shift gears completely to look at some other work, which is one thing about technology is how much effort we put into keeping up with it. And I had a series of works on paper that were based on Walkman design and deconstructing Walkman design, but also I felt in a way giving a nod to Bauhaus and looking at mass production and the machine aesthetic versus handmade. So there's an exhibition in Brooklyn called the Walkman Compositions that was this past January, and they also, lend themselves to a conversation about Kelly, but you're looking at the source and then starting to take apart the machine to its formal design elements. So I'll just go through. These are also collage and ink on paper, 11 by 15. And this was a series of, I think, 10, but they're not all here. And the orange dots are part of the Sony logo, which was a little sound equalizer. And this is like the shaped green Kelly that we saw just moments ago. So back to the chart, because I like charts. So if we look at the other side of it, and a way that I just sort of in the last year came to find a way of working that addressed the non-geometric side. And I'm excited about it because I am so used to working on very hard edge, very focused, mainly small works on paper, that doing something more expressive and more organic and improvised was kind of a challenge. So believe it or not, that led to this gentleman. You wouldn't necessarily think of the organic when you think of Kenny G, maybe it's curls or something. But when I was working on the Walkman series, I also started doing some cassette mixing for the first time, and I was working with the auto reverse button on a Walkman and making sound pieces that were about finding the weird space between sides A and B and mixing through cassette. So I was looking for source material to mix with for those sound pieces, and I purchased a lot of someone's jazz collection on eBay, which is the best place to buy art supplies. And I had like 120 jazz cassettes that came, and there was really cool stuff like Ella Fitzgerald in Berlin, but it was all in Japanese because it was like this crazy bootleg, and it was just a lot of great stuff. And in this box, there were 5 Kenny G tapes that were still shrink-wrapped, and they still had the price tag on them from Tower, and they were like, $5.99. And I put them on my desk for like 6 months, and I was like, what am I going to do with Kenny G? Because I really cannot mix it. I don't think I could like really listen to it enough to work with it for a sound project. And just the way the universe is, I was walking home and I saw a pile of audio tape on the sidewalk, which used to be much more common when the tapes would get stuck in the car and people would chuck them out. And I thought, he needs to be liberated. So I started pulling Kenny G from his case to achieve a series of works on paper called Breathless from the Breathless CD, Breathless tape, and pulling the tape out and stretching it and working with line. And it really is also very much about the aesthetic of mid-century modernism and line drawing. And I'm up to, I think, 19 in the series. And it's been a fun and interesting process to start to shift back and forth and practice from really hard edge work to something that's much more expressive, and to give Kenny G back the gesture I think he removed from what was once a very avant-garde form of music. He's kind of the one who made it into elevator music, When you say jazz, it's a bad word because you think of Kenny. At the beginning and end of each tape, there's a little section of blue, which is silent. So as the series goes on, each group is going to have one book ending with the blue with the silence. And then finally, I actually went to the Louise Bourgeois show and almost got kicked out of the Guggenheim because I was like, oh, while I'm here, I should take a photograph like the Coltrane photograph. And you're not allowed to, I think the ramp is like copywritten or something, but they won't let you take cameras up. So here I am, very quickly and sneakily trying to point to the audio guide so that I could continue this conversation of presence and absence and the presence of sound and the presence of abstraction in the Guggenheim. And I probably presented more questions than I did actually answering questions, so I hope that the Q&A will be satisfying. Thank you. Hi. Mm-hmm. The white, go ahead. Yeah. In that sense, it mirrors the drawings, and like the black flat-paneled speakers, there were works on paper also that were solid blocks of color that read like a music score, and so continuing the line of the note up in the drawings was referenced in the speaker and the wire. When I first started making these drawings, they were initially studies for kind of incomprehensible installations. Like, this is not possible. You could not have a 55-pound subwoofer hanging from a line in space. But that relationship is definitely there. And it is weird. Like, I think there's a big effort to try to hide equipment and make things as clean as possible. And so it's nice to play with that. And one speaker in the exhibition is hidden, and one is exposed because it just lend itself to that. So, yeah, a little both. Yeah. It's more the room, I think. Yeah. And this was the first time that I attempted to work with directional sound. And that's, treading into learning more about the technical end of it instead of just making drawings. So I'm educating myself about equipment, and that technology is evolving really fast. But it's usually 100% an aesthetic choice because I came to the technical end of it quite late, I think. I mean, I initially started as a painter, and then after getting into photography and collage, I just went right back to paper, and that was like trying to own making drawings. So it is about the relationship of the speaker to the space more than what's coming out of it, in a sense. That guy in the back.
When you were upstairs, you mentioned something about being in Chicago as part of your career. How influenced were you, if any, by the avant-garde music scene in Chicago, AOC and all that?
Not very much. I mean, when I was an undergrad, I was really painting. I was just really a painter. I mean, I had. It's kind of funny because it's like the jazz was always in the house growing up. It was one of those things where you don't listen to your parents' music and then you get old enough to learn that it's the shit, and it was there the whole time. And then you start asking your parents all kinds of questions about who they saw live in concert. But when I was in Chicago, was more like going to the blues scene kind of stuff. But no, I was entrenched in the painting end of it. So, hi. You're like, hi. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's hard because I think it's still like this weird sense of permission to work in a certain way. And I always like to reference Ellen Gallagher as someone who really pushed, making big-ass abstract paintings that contend with that aspect of art history or that version of art history. Because there's certainly other abstract artists that aren't necessarily in the canon in that way. But it means something for, like, Malevich to make a black painting, and it means something else for Ellen Gallagher to make a black painting. And I think that tension is interesting, that there's still this tethered to narrative and identity in that way, when as artists there is also just another conversation between artists happening. So it's really multi-layered. But, going to school in the early 90s at the peak of multiculturalism and a lot of theory and criticism, I really, it took me a long time to say it's okay to make a drawing, it's okay to talk about color, and that I can still participate in a conversation that is about this, and that I could turn it around and say, well, actually my struggle as addressing that or owning abstraction is an interesting way to not only just do it, but then to bring it to shed light on it and bring that conversation forward. So, yeah. Yeah, okay. Fluffy. It's funny because I matched it from a JPEG, and I went to this kooky little Apple art store near Pratt, and they have, I don't know why, but they have a lot of graphic design papers that are really old, and so I just kind of went through a stack of blue and just hoped that that would be close. But Kelly's, he has mastered creating colors that you don't see, that are very specific to him. So I was surprised that I got as close as I did for that series. No, I didn't paint the paper. And it's funny, the other collage, a lot of the source for the color comes from art forums. So I find it very cathartic to rip up art forum magazines. But it's also interesting to look through art magazines, but only interpret them like, oh, I'm looking for reds. So you're looking through all this stuff, but you're looking at it strictly as this object. And so a lot of times, like my little color hunts for a series, and the series will be capped off when I run out of a color. So sometimes there's only 12 drawings because I don't have that red anymore, and so it's going to stop. So, yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's definitely there. There's the other bigger level is like the color theory and sound theory, and there's a lot of scientific investigation that has happened between visualizing colors matching with certain sounds, and like C's, the yellows, and there's this kind of theory in the 70s there was a lot written about that. It's certainly there, but the sound for me is more historic excavation than it is getting deeply into music theory. I actually tried to take a music theory class at the New School, and I think after like the fourth evening class, the teacher was like, so you don't play an instrument? And I'm like, no. He's like, you don't sing? I'm like, not really. He's like, you're going to have a hard time as soon as we get a little bit. But I wanted to watch the mark making. I wanted to investigate, to see someone writing a score on a chalkboard and look at mark making in relation to drawing. And it was a fun experience, but it did kind of affirm for me that, and there were also people that, not to boast, but I think that we're like, wow, you have a great ear, because I could recognize intervals, but there were people that could really read music that couldn't hear intervals. So there was like a little disconnect there, but it solidified for me that I cannot go down that road of learning how to read music at this point and working with this structure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think Slow Birds came to mind for this because of the tone, and when I remastered it for this space at the Contemporary, which also I wanted to add more bass and thinking about deepening those chords, deepening it because of the deep blue. So there was definitely a moment in that thought process where I wanted that sound to be deeper and as deep as I have the kind of ephemeral weight to the sound that the color field, that the black and blue paintings would have this weight but still be airy. So yeah, that was there for that project. It's not always the case where I don't think like, oh, I'm going to work with Ella Fitzgerald and therefore I feel like it's fuchsia, like that kind of moment. No, it's usually more about the sound itself. Yeah. Thank you. Well, I was late to it, coming to it also. Yeah. He doesn't say. The audio of that was an interview at Art Basel, just not this one, the last one. And he doesn't say what the illness was. I can't imagine. Some kind of fever, scarlet fever. Mm-hmm. I miss analog, and the reason I started doing the Walkman compositions was I wanted the tangible again, and I also, I don't want to say it's laziness or frustration, but, everyone's like, well, what kind of software do you have, and are you upgrading? What system are you on? And that's, I had a block for a while where the technology was keeping me from manifesting my projects because I just felt like, oh my God, I have to go back to school to learn this stuff. And I just said, screw it. I'm going to get analog, This is what I know. I know how to plug something in and push a button. So how can I play with those devices and also give them a new life again? Like, everyone thinks of the first time they had headphones on, or my age anyway, or, listen to a transistor radio, or that the ways we listen have changed so drastically that, just to go back and archive some of this equipment and to look at the formal elements of how it's designed is, so I still think that records sound better than CDs. They're rich. Absolutely. Yeah, because it's funny because the first iPods that were it was just scrolling text, and when they got the color screen, I think that I'm pretty sure that they went back to your ability to virtually flip through albums was because people just missed it. And you don't want to just scroll through a list of words. You want to see James Brown album cover. That relationship is gone. And I mean, liner notes used to be great, and you have music critics write about what you were listening to, and it became more than just that. And also the ability to, there was studio recordings were in a sequence for a reason, and there was an A and a B side for a reason. If you pluck one song out of an album, it's like, taking one painting out of an entire exhibition and it gets reframed, and I think that's a drag. I think that musicians actually think more of singles than they do thinking of making an album. They think more of like what's going to be the hook, what's going to be the single, and not what is this body of work. So it's a bummer. Download. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is about the balance of, yeah, the balance of weight and making tension, and that's just, I mean, that's very organic part of decision making while I'm working on the series, and I do tend to work on like 2 or 3 next to each other, and always in a series. So hopefully you'll go to the contemporary, which has been, oh yeah, okay, and because when they're all in a row, then there's another language that happens that reads, hopefully harkens a music score, and that those bits of color are bouncing. But yeah, the tension. There's something in music called tension and resolution, which I think happens in the drawings, and all music, most music tries to have a sense of resolution to it, and you don't end a song on like a really off, wacky note unless you're doing it on purpose. So that relationship to things touching in that little space in between. And then the audio jack, if it's plugged in or just hanging, little metaphors. Well, the one series I made was specifically all mixed on cassette. I mean, you could hear these things on my website. I have a listening page, so if you want to, on your own, listen to some of these different things I've referenced. But a lot of times I'll, listening to records, then I'll get the CD, and then I can bring that into the computer. So there is a digital editing element, but it's freeware, it's not complicated. It's really cutting and pasting and making collage out of audio. So what I'm looking at is like a sound wave of the song and cutting sections out and mixing and yeah. Yeah. And with the cassettes, just because of the nature of the beast, the cassette mixing ended up having to run through. So it's another weird thing where I made a cassette mix and then it ends up being played in the gallery on a CD. Because you can't really play a Walkman in a gallery on a, so.
But you're also applying paint to the canvas with a brush.
No, those were paintings directly on the wall, on the wall. Those the large wall paintings, and then it's all collage on paper. So it's paper on paper for the drawings.